Protectionism will only hurt oneself, and unilateral moves will bring damage to all, said Chinese State Councilor and Foreign Minister Wang at the general debate of the 73rd session of the General Assembly of the UN. As multilateralism faces mounting pressures from unilateralism, and livelihoods are endangered due to growing threats like conflict and sluggish economic growth. More countries are maybe reshaping their development path. So what are China's views on major international and regional issues? How do we assess the UN's efforts to maintain multilateralism, safeguard its authority and facilitate world peace and development? And what should we do to improve development that's relevant to all people? To discuss these issues and more, I'm happy to be joined in the studio by Mr. Rong Ying, Vice President and a Senior Research Fellow at the China Institute of International Studies, Ms. Claire Pearson, the former Chair of the British Chamber of Commerce in China, and Mr. Rick Dunham, a visiting scholar at Tsinghua University. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Pan Dong. Before we get started, let's take a look at this.
This speech was a full-throated defense of the United Nations and the multilateral rules-based global order in the face of growing challenges and difficulties.
Equality, mutual trust and win-win cooperation are the call of our times, whereas power politics and the rule of the jungle find no support.
Without citing the US tariffs and Washington's criticism of Chinese trade and industrial policies, Wang defended China's record of reform and opening up. He also reminded the Assembly of China's contribution as an engine of growth in the global economy.
China stayed true to its commitment through the negotiation process on its return to the GATT and then ascension to the WTO negotiations that lasted 15 long years and were concluded at a certain price. China fulfilled its promise and integrated itself into the world economic system. After the international financial crisis broke out, China chose not to stand idly by, but to work together with other countries to tide over the rough times. For years running, China has contributed over 30% of global growth.
And there was a warning to Washington too.
China would not be blackmailed or yield to pressure.
Wang also highlighted China's development agenda enshrined in the Belt and Road Initiative and his nation's commitment to sustainable development and the Paris Climate Agreement. He reiterated China's support for the Iran nuclear deal, endorsed renewed diplomacy to achieve denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula, and he said solving problems in Myanmar's Rakhine state will require a cessation of violence, the return of refugees and economic development. Earlier, Wang Yi visited the prestigious Council on Foreign Relations, where he dismissed US claims that China wants to displace the US as the leading global power. Wang stressed China wants a peaceful, harmonious rise and said current difficulties with the US could be solved. But when these differences might be solved is the big question. There are no scheduled talks between Washington and Beijing when it comes to solving the trade war, and there's an increasing anti-China rhetoric coming from the White House. Now, Wang Yi offered no timeline for the solving of these differences, though he remains hopeful. Nathan King, CGTN, at the United Nations in New York.
So, dear guests, let's start with the theme of this year's UNGA General Assembly. It's making the UN relevant to all people, with a focus on global leadership and shared responsibilities. And in his speech to the session, UN Chief Antonio Guterres made it very clear that multilateralism is under fire. So our multilateralism and world body is in a danger of being marginalized, Mr. Wang.
Yeah, I think if you look at the latest development for the past few years, particularly by the some of the major countries' policy toward that, I think it's quite reasonable or natural to raise this question. That is, whether we should continue to stay committed to multilateralism or should have the unilateralism to have its way, and how we can make sure UN, the premier platform for multilateralism, to stay relevant and to help provide an answer to address the issues that facing the people, facing the world at this moment.
Right, and to echo this theme, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi said, what we see today is that international rules and multilateral mechanisms are under attack, and the international landscape is filled with uncertainties and destabilizing factors. People have sensed urgency there. So what are those destabilizing factors, Ms. Pearson?
The destabilising factors at the moment are the trade war with the US, the situation in the Middle East, North Korea, but mainly it's people who are not willing to be team players. The United Nations has never been more needed than today because of those factors that we mentioned. The two key factors that are going to destabilise the world: climate change, migration. China is trying to bring the team together. China is trying to be a team leader within the United Nations. It's trying to be a broker between the developed and the less developed world. So my feeling is that, yes, the United Nations, why was it set up? It was set up because we were in a very uncertain period. Woodrow Wilson set up the League of Nations, but then this morphed into the United Nations, which the US was the biggest proponent of. So to see them pulling back is very disappointing at this point, and I feel like China, of all countries, really understands the need for global stability negotiated via multilateral institutions like the UN at present. The world is as unstable now as it was when the UN was established. So to start unraveling it, this is the wrong time.
So you think climate change and migration, human migration, could be the most daunting challenges for the future. But what about unilateralism, Mr. Dong?
Yes, I don't think that multilateralism in and of itself is on the wane. I think that specifically there is an American president, Donald Trump, who is a unilateralist, who does not believe in global institutions or multilateral agreements. So I don't think that the world is turning away, although there are some nationalist movements, neo-nationalist movements. I think the challenge is that the United States has always been at the core of the post-Second World War multinational world, and it is both retreating and throwing hand grenades into it. And I think that the challenge is for the rest of the world to figure out how do we keep the institutions of multilateralism moving forward while you have a major player that's changing its role significantly.
Right, and to uphold the multilateral system, Foreign Minister Wang in his speech raised 4 principles. Let's start with the first one. The world shall pursue win-win cooperation. How does this relate to Chinese President Xi Jinping's idea of building a community of shared future for humankind?
Indeed, I think 2 years ago, back in 2015, I think on the same podium, President Xi made a major speech putting forward, the vision to promoting the building of a community of shared future for mankind. And of course, ever since then, that has been a lot of discussion both in China and abroad, and the new development, how to particularly implement or translate into practice of this vision. And I think the State Councilor and Foreign Minister Wang Yi, by sort of proposing the 4 principles to pursue multilateralism for new era, is meant, I think, of course, help address this issue. And so the 4 principles are very important. The first principle is about how to achieve win-win cooperation. In other words, instead of confrontation, and countries should work together through cooperation. And instead of kind of winner take all, and China is, as always, proposing a kind of win-win result through cooperation. And the other 3 principles are all very important from Chinese perspective.
And we'll be talking about them one by one. Ms. Pearson, talking about win-win cooperation, you used to be the chair of British Chamber of Commerce in China. In business, do you think win-win can be achieved? Because obviously US President Donald Trump thinks differently.
I don't think there's any option. I mean, we've had a period pre-UN where sovereignty was the way forward. What did we have before 1950? We had 2 world wars, and, you know, China wasn't having a great time. So what happened in 1950? People got together, they invented United Nations, the European Union, commune ism. People began to work together for the collective good. I saw a really interesting poster advertising the UN in 1950. It said, "Go alone," and it showed a guy walking along, "Walk along with Hitler, walk along with a dictator." Or it said, "Go together, carpool." You know, everyone was getting in a car together and they were setting off in the same direction. I work here in business, and it is really difficult to get international institutions, international companies, international clients to work together. But the hard work is the prerequisite for peace that creates prosperity. And I think that there is an absolute Xuanying, an absolute win-win opportunity. You cannot be a short-termist sovereign nation guy in what is effectively a multilateral world. The problems that affect the world, global trade, climate change, migration, these are borderless issues. Business can be a glue. When I was at the British Chamber of Commerce, I made sure my committee was 50% Chinese because we're the British Chamber of Commerce in China. So unless your institution reflects the global demographic with which you are working, you will not make decisions which are sustainable. You will have short-term economic wins for long-term economic loss. Xuanying means getting it right today so you have a sustainable global economic future tomorrow. And if people pull away from the UN table, they pull away from a prosperous future within their own country and within the world at large.
Right, now let's turn to the second principle. All nations shall act upon rules and order. It's a formidable answer to rising unilateralism led by the United States indeed. It's been withdrawing from international institutions and international deals. So Foreign Minister Wang also warns the danger of the world going back to the law of the jungle. Do you think that's an imminent scenario, Mr. Donald?
I don't think it's an imminent threat, but I think it's a threat that we have to be worried about. You have to think, with Donald Trump as President of the United States, he believes that it's within his power to unilaterally withdraw from agreements that previous presidents have signed, like the Iran nuclear deal, or the Paris climate change accords. I mean, he believes it's within his power to reverse decades of American policy without the approval of Congress or other bodies in the United States. So I do think it's important to have an international rules-based order. To me, the irony of all of this is that the United States had been saying this about China and the Chinese economy for decades, before the entrance of China into the WTO and in the years since then. And now it's just turned around and thrown back at the United States, where the United States is not following the global rules-based order.
Having said that, it looks like the Trump administration is playing foreign affairs into the hearts and minds of populism, and his former chief strategist, Steve Bannon, is trying to establish a foundation in Brussels to line up populist parties in European Union. So do you think this will have a global effect and may have backfire in domestic politics in the US?
I think it's for Bannon, who was really the brains behind the neo-populism in the US. I think the next step for the Trump world order is populist revolts in Europe. And I think that Trump will be an aberration unless his revolution succeeds beyond the borders of the US. It was sort of like the communist revolution. If there were no revolutions beyond the Russian borders, communism was not going to be an international movement. So I think Bannon is thinking very much like Lenin right now. And I think for the future of Trumpism in the United States, it's important that it not be completely isolated. Yes, they like to be victims. Victims of China, victims of the EU, victims of women, victims of minorities. But for real long-term victories, they have to have some allies.
Right, we'll continue this after a short while. You're watching Dialogue on CGTN. Stay with us. So, dear guests, let's talk about the third principles mentioned in Foreign Minister Wang Yi's speech. The world shall uphold fairness and justice. Let's take trade for an example, because Trump wants so-called fair trade. So, but his self-entitled fairness, is that the real meaning of fairness in the world order, Mr. Wang?
I'm not sure. I think international trade has been kind of a complementary and also kind of win-win nature. And I think the argument for instead of free trade to fair trade, for me the problem is that on what rules and what sort of ground to define that. But the most important thing is that I believe that it neglects the nature of international trade. And also, of course, if you look at the trade dispute between China and the United States and the way that the Trump administration is trying to push or pressurize China to find a way to address this dispute is very much disturbing. And China has consistently talked about a kind of solving or address these issues through talks and negotiations. And China has made, of course, very clear that it would do whatever possible to defend, safeguard its legitimate interests. And more importantly, I think in the speech, State Councilor and Foreign Minister Wang Yi also made it very clear. This is certainly for the sake of its own interest, but more importantly, it is also for a stable sort of international and trade system that would be benefit, I mean, to the world at large. So it is more than a kind of a bilateral trade dispute. It is largely, I think, have implications, bearings on the trade system with WTO as a center and free trade, and I think also these rules that has been help the countries that benefit from that.
Right. When we talk about multilateralism, the World Trade Organization is a shining example of the outcome of multilateralism, but the Trump administration says it's a bad mechanism that's taken advantage of the United States, but actually the United States won almost 90% of litigation cases in the World Trade Body. So, but absolutely, WTO needs reforms. So what do you think are the most urgent tasks for the World Trade Body at this moment?
I think the World Trade Body needs to communicate more effectively with its stakeholders. Yes, there needs to be some streamlining, but fundamentally it's a very important institution. I mean, China is a very big country in terms of GDP, but it's not so powerful in terms of GDP per capita. So when a country is still developing, it does need tariffs to protect its workers, to protect its jobs. And we've got to remember those tariffs are also applied in places like Europe, places like the US, and that's why the WTO exists. So you get a balanced perspective. You don't get one country dominating the economic world order. So I think that, yes, it's difficult. WTO is difficult. But it exists for a reason. It exists to let countries develop to a point where they can be globally competitive. And I think anyone who attacks it is attacking the fundamentals of globalization. And you really need to wonder what sort of self-interested pre-election propaganda they're trying to put out.
Right, and talking about the ongoing US-China trade war, Foreign Minister Wang Yi made it very clear in his speech that China will not be blackmailed or yield to pressure. So do you think there's a way out at this moment for the trade tensions between the world's two largest economies? They're not talking.
The short term, I don't see anything before the U.S. election, because I don't think that Donald Trump wants to back down or show any signs of weakness before the midterm elections where the future of Congress is at stake. I think that there has to be a way both sides can declare a victory. Donald Trump's world of real estate is I win, you lose. And that's not the way trade works. It's certainly not the way diplomacy with China works. You can't tell China, you have to change, I'm not giving you anything, you give me everything I want. So there has to be a way that things can be negotiated beyond tariffs. The United States, in my opinion, has some legitimate complaints about China in trade, and there are things that have been negotiated for years to try to open markets, to try to deal with intellectual property, with sharing of technology transfer. But a tariff war doesn't do anything to solve that. We have to figure out a way to go from how do we increase the percentage of on tariffs to how do we negotiate these legitimate issues that are the future of free trade in the world, and really, instead of the use of free trade, trade liberalization, making trade more widespread around the world.
Right, and the fourth principle is all nations must act to deliver real results. So, Mr. Long, let's talk about the reform of the world body, the United Nations itself. What are the major sticking points at the moment?
I think the sticking point for UN, the premium sort of platform for multilateralism, is, of course, there's kind of a gap between expectations and its capabilities. And so, in other words, I think the Secretary General, Guterres, when he took over, his priority areas, of course, has announced that the peace and development, peace and security, economic development issues, and the third area for him is so-called international management. In other words, have to make sure the UN organizations are possibly the largest bureaucracy, and how it can be more responsive, more accountable, and more importantly, I think it would be able to find a way to help mobilize and bring the stakeholders together to find a way to that. And of course, again, Wang made it very clear that they always support that, but he also made a point, a very important point. For that to happen, UN is supposed to receive a sort of stable and predictable sort of a budget. And of course, he was further said that, went on by saying that China has sort of paid its due in time, and hoping that the other countries that have been owed due to do the job. So if we are looking for a more effective, more efficient sort of UN, and we got to work together and we'll help. Find a way to address the reform, but also equally important is that the budget has to be balanced. Has to be
right. So, Ms. Pearson, what do you make of the progress so far in UN reforms?
No, I think that the UN has got a long way to go. I was in Geneva UN not long ago. Even the cafeteria wasn't open. There was some union action. Right. You've got a phenomenal opportunity to bring the world together there, but they can't sit down and eat together. And I thought, what is going on? So I walked all around the UN. I visited all the bodies, and they're doing important work. There was a group who were doing mine clearance. It's a thankless job. Somebody's going to get their leg blown off. Nobody wants to do that job. The UN does the dirty jobs that don't make money that the world needs doing. But does it need to be a bit more responsive? Yes, it does. It's got to communicate more effectively with the people. I've got a friend, he's from South Sudan. He was in the UN in New York. And I said, how was that? It must have been a phenomenal opportunity. He said, not really. Because he said the different interest groups, the different silos stick together. So it needs to get less siloed. It's still very siloed. It needs to make sure that there's really better communication with outside stakeholders. It needs to get its cafe open. It needs to sort out its internal unionism. Right. It's doing a great job, but just make sure that it's facilitated by a sustainable budget to deliver policy effectively.
And also efficiency.
Efficiency.
The world's largest bureaucratic
It's shut at 5 o'clock. We all know that's lunchtime in Beijing.
not that late, I would say. Maybe 2 is the latest.
Maybe we need a UN in Beijing so they can learn how to work properly. Then they could be New York, Geneva, Beijing.
Refreshing idea.
They're kind of missing here.
Yeah. So we've talked enough about multilateralism. So what about China's commitment to world peace and development? Wang Yi reaffirmed China's commitment to its own peaceful development, and he said China will work with other countries and contribute its share to global peace and security. Having said that, Ms. Dunham, what do you make of China's role in hotspot issues around the world, like the denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula and Iran nuclear issue?
Well, China has walked a fine line of being involved in a positive way in multilateral issues and in hotspot issues without getting militarily involved. And I mean, Syria is a very good example of that, where you have the United States, Russia, others militarily involved. China is involved trying to come to some sort of consensus, as difficult as that is. You look at Korea and Iran, and you have China involved in the process, very difficult process in Iran of negotiating an agreement. And in Korea, it will not be done without China. I mean, you have China, United States, North Korea, South Korea are the essential nations. I mean, we don't know where it's going with Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un, but China is indispensable in coming to an agreement that can be enforced. And China is indispensable when it comes to figuring out what to do with sanctions. When are sanctions? When has North Korea done enough that we can start lifting sanctions? So I think that, yes, China is becoming much more active on the problem solving. The question is, can China stay out of the military side at the same time as it takes more and more responsibility for solving the problems of the world?
Right, now let's talk about China's economic development. In his speech, Wang Yi said that over several years, in recent several years, China has contributed over 30% of global growth, and this year also marks the 40th anniversary of China's reform and opening up, which eventually turned itself into the world's second largest economy. So what about the road ahead? What, after those promises, what measures and concrete policies can we expect, Mr. Li?
I think, of course, the China's development per se, it's a great contribution, I mean, to development of the world. If you look at the poverty sort of reduction, I mean, for the past 4 decades since China's reform and opening up, China has literally sort of lifted, I mean, over 700 million population, people out of poverty, contributing over 70% of the population are living under poverty. So itself is a big contribution. And more importantly, I think China's experiences, I mean, in pushing, I mean, making sustainable development by sort of finding what we call the road, it suits us conditions, and by continuously sort of pursuing reform and opening up, also means a lot for developing countries that also would like to find its own road of development for development. And I think as China grows, as China develops, now it is playing a more important role in helping, in pushing the other developing country by promoting a kind of a north-south cooperation and north and south-south dialogue. And China itself is also, for example, the recently concluded Beijing summit of FOCAC, and China has put forward.
And also the Belt and Road.
Yeah, the Belt and Road certainly is so far the most important thing. So China is trying a lot by itself. I mean, by the example of itself, but also as it grows and it also making contributions.
While being a responsible player on the world stage. Thank you very much, dear guests. And that's it for this edition of Dialogue on CGTN. I'm Pan Dong in Beijing. Bye-bye.